What we must realize, the bottom line, the early Christians, the people of the Reformation, the founding father of this country faced and acted on, is the realization that if there is no place for disobeying the government, that government has been put in the place of the living God. In such a case, the government has been made a false god. If there is no place for disobeying a human government, that government has been made God.
From then on, it spread very quickly. Just after Everett installed the Prussian model in the state of Massachusetts, the governor of New York set up the very same method in 12 New York schools. Horace Mann's sister, Elizabeth Peabody, of the Peabody Foundation, saw to it that right after the Civil War, the Prussian system that was then being taught in the northern states was integrated into the conquered South. By 1900, most of the compulsory schooling laws that implemented the new system had been passed. From then on, every American child grew up under the Prussian system. So what exactly was the Prussian education system that everyone thought was so amazing that it just had to be adopted throughout the free world? To give you just a bit of background, in the 18th century, the Kingdom of Prussia, which is now modern-day Germany, was among the first countries of the world to introduce free and compulsory education. After the Prussians were defeated by Napoleon in 1806, it was decided that the reason why the battle was lost was that the Prussian soldiers were thinking for themselves in the battlefield instead of following orders. To make sure that this couldn't happen again, a new 8-year system of schooling was created. This new system provided not only the skills needed for the early industrialized world, such as reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also a strict education that taught duty, discipline, respect for authority, and the ability to follow orders. Elite children destined for higher offices went on to attend private schools, while the rest of the population had no access to the secondary education. They were destined for the working class. Through this new system, the Prussian court tried to create social obedience in the citizens through indoctrination. Every individual had to become convinced at the core of their being that the king was just, his decisions were always right, and the need for obedience paramount. In truth, the entire purpose of this system was to instill loyalty to the crown and to train young men for the military and bureaucracy. To do this, it was necessary to squeeze out all independent thinking from the masses.
Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing.
For the banking industry.
The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, the second biggest bank collapse in U.S. history.
Signature Bank marks the 3rd largest bank failure in U.S. history.
First Republic Bank has been sold to J.P. Morgan.
The bank over the last several months has been facing a pair of lawsuits alleging that it benefited from Epstein's sex trafficking.
Do you know what a central bank digital currency is?
The United States Federal Reserve is considering the creation of a digital dollar.
CBDC could offer a range of benefits.
The Federal Reserve is considering a digital dollar.
The phrase, "In God We Trust," that's not really what they started out wanting. It was Christians. And they had actually said to Congress that in a hypothetical annihilation, this is their language, a hypothetical annihilation of the United States in the future, antiquaries of the future would have determined that America had been a pagan nation based on the symbols of the Great Seal and the way Washington, D.C. was laid out. Even the old-timers knew this. And they wanted something in our government that would reflect that widespread Christian view that was held among the mostly agrarian communities at that time. And it was opposed by the Freemasons. It was opposed by the President of the United States. They did not want something saying we are a Christian nation. And they finally compromised and put "In God We Trust" because of the ambiguity.
I spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets use the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There's no mystery. There's nothing to do with espionage. I know that espionage intelligence gathering looks more romantic. It sells more deodorants through the advertising, probably. That's why your Hollywood producers are so crazy about James Bond type of thrillers. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process, which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interest of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid of society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
And yet these people who've been programmed and, as you say, in place and who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept, these are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people. And the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. Obviously they will join the links of dissenters, dissidents. Yes. Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. Here you can get popular like Daniel Ellsberg and filthy rich like Jane Fonda for being dissident, for criticizing your Pentagon. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. Nobody is going to pay them nothing for their beautiful, noble ideas of equality. This they don't understand, and it will be greatest shock for them, of course. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes then he will understand, but not before that.
So what did the big 3 banking families want at the Jekyll Island meeting? Central control over the American money supply. By the turn of the century, the biggest New York banks could control less than half of the American money supply. States were still chartering their own banks, and the center of financial gravity was rapidly shifting westward, away from New York. Something had to be done to bring it all under one central control point back in New York. Public outrage was affecting their political control over the nation. They knew that they had only a relatively brief window of time to propose a legislative solution that would allow them to increase their control, yet disguise it as a reform truly in the public interest. Secrecy was essential. If secrecy was essential, If the newspapers found out about the meeting before the legislation could be rushed through Congress, all could be lost in a tidal wave of genuine monetary reform that might permanently remold the money power to actually serve the public interest. Senator Aldrich returned to Washington with the new central bank plan. The most difficult challenge was how to sell it to the American public. The name would be all important. Certainly the word bank could not have any part of the name because the public was at this point aware of what they called the money trust. The mechanism proposed was very similar to the old Bank of the United States. The bill gave the new bank the power to issue U.S. currency, lend the government money at interest, then convert that federal debt into money to be loaned out to its member banks 10 times over or more to their customers. What a deal! Never before had a central bank sought such complete control over the banks of a nation and its supply of money. What was looming over the financial horizon was a debt monster, far bigger and more destructive than anything proposed before. According to Congressman Lindbergh, the initial proposal presented to Congress was to give the new central bank a 50-year charter. Incidentally, the Greek Parliament granted the privately owned Greek central bank a 50-year charter in January of 2013. So year after year, the same scam is being perpetrated on the people of every nation. Congressman Lindbergh wrote that Aldrich's Monetary Commission
spent over $300,000 in order to learn how to form a plan by which to create a greater money trust, and it afterwards recommended to Congress to give this proposed trust a 50-year charter, by means of which it could rob and plunder all humanity.
Support for the very reform that the bankers actually wanted, the passage of the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913. Although the bill passed by an overwhelming majority, only 22% of the House members actually remained in Washington to vote on the final bill.
And it was just before Christmas, as you know, and the congressmen, senators had visions of sugar plum fairies, and they were off to their Christmas parties, and didn't take time to even try to understand the ramifications of the legislation, which was the biggest heist in the history of humanity.
Although the bill appeared to spread out power through 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, the bill as passed left significant issues to be settled after the Fed actually began operations. In reality, the bill created just another privately owned central bank. The stock would be owned by all the national banks in the country, which in turn would be owned by their private stockholders. The Fed would be no more federal than Federal Express. Furthermore, federal courts have ruled that the Fed is a private corporation. The Fed is a private corporation. So how did it work out? Did this private corporation, cleverly disguised to look like a public institution pretending to operate in the public interest, save America from the painful booms and busts of the dreaded business cycle? Well, less than 16 years after the passage of the Federal Reserve Act on October 29, 1929, the New York stock market crashed, dragging the rest of the world into the deepest, most long-lasting depression of the 20th century. International trade decreased by 50%. Unemployment in the U.S. rose to 25%, and in some countries as high as 33%. So was it an accident, or was it just that old wascally business cycle acting up again? According to Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, it was deliberate. The Fed could have stopped the Depression at any time by pumping money into the system, but instead they let the money supply decline by 33%, sending most banks into bankruptcy. Friedman put it this way in his 1996 interview with National Public Radio.
The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933.
I don't think there's ever been a recession or a depression that was necessary. It is because the current system, where nearly all of the money is created as debt, and as debt on which interest has to be paid, is like a system where the bankers blow debt into a balloon. And it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and things are quite prosperous when they're still blowing the debt in the balloon. And then all of a sudden, the debt burden becomes so great that the system won't carry it. And then it's like a balloon with a pin stuck in it. And things crash, asset values drop. A lot of people lose their homes, their farms, and their jobs, and all unnecessarily.
So long as the Fed is owned by the banks, and the banks are in complete control over the quantity of a national money, and that national money is lent into existence by the banks, guess what? Money can never serve the public interest, and only a system of debt serfdom, worldwide debt serfdom, can possibly result.
There's a reason why the Washington Monument has a magic square in its base where a Bible is bound. There's a reason there's a magic 666 square above that altar in the house of the temple where I was at. There's a reason there are 72 pentagrams. In their Gnosticism, they believe 72 demons control the nations of the earth, and they have bound them at the base of the apotheosis of Washington. This is the underbelly of the U.S. Capitol Dome. It's called the apotheosis of George Washington, which means to become a god. What god did he become? Well, look at the heaven that he's rising into. There's not one Christian symbol. There's no Jesus. There's no cross. There is no Michael the Archangel. Every part of the underbelly of the U.S. Capitol Dome is filled with pagan gods. Here's the god Vulcan, whom Manly P. Hall tells us fills the Freemasons' hands with the seething energies of Lucifer. That's the heaven he went into. At his funeral, Freemasons cast sprigs of acacia upon his body to represent that he had gone into the underworld to take his role as Osiris so that the next president could become the resurrected Osiris. Well, the occult have a plan. God has a better one, and you better know whose side you're on. Learn more at the Future Congress. Here's the most important one. Thank you, Noah, for giving me another